I'm just scratching the surface. I'm just scratching the surface.
Hi everyone, it's Mr. Lightcap from S.T.E.A.M class. Welcome to my shop. Today I'm going to show you a few different things that I'm going to work on. I want to make a cabinet face for a cabinet that I'm working on, and that'll lead to some more cabinet faces for a customer that I'm building. And maybe you guys can try to do some of the things that I'm doing at home if you have similar tools, or if not, you can at least see what some of the tools are that I use at home and think about how you might want to use those in the future, or do something similar in the future, or at least know what they are and how they work. Okay, so I'm going to start by taking measurements. So this is 9 5/8 inches wide, and the opening vertically is 25 and a half. So I want to have a bit of a reveal on my door. That means that you're going to be able to see a little bit of the back here. And I also want the door to be able to clear this. I'm going to put another piece of walnut right in there. So I'm thinking I'll come in maybe 1/4, 3/8, 1/2 inch. Not quite sure. Okay, so I did some test holes and I used this cabinet hinge bit for these recessed hidden hinges. Now these we had left over from a job. They're not my favorite because they don't have a whole lot of room, and it turns out they need to be pretty much right up against the edge, which is a little bit tricky to do, but it'll work. It's just shop hardware, so I'm gonna use what I have left over. So these will sit on here and sit like that. That's actually a 1/2 inch from the side that you can see there. So when it's open, it will sit like this, and then it needs to have just enough clearance there, you see, to be able to close and not hit. So that necessitates that 1/2 inch opening. So I'm going to do a 1/2 inch reveal. So here's my little book where I do all of my measurements and planning. So here are the measurements we took: 9 5/8 in the width. These are in inches, right? And 25 and a half up and down. So if I want to take a 1/2 inch off over here and a 1/2 inch off over here, and I want a 1/2 inch from both sides here, right? That means I'm going to take off a 1/2 inch and a 1/2 inch. That's 1 whole inch. That's right. So 9 5/8 inches minus an inch is going to give us 8 5/8. Easy breezy. Couldn't be easier, right? And 25 and a half, take away an inch, is going to be 24 and a half. So our total door frame, which is going to look like this, is going to be 24 and a half by 8 5/8. So what I'm going to do is take my lumber now, and I'm going to go cut that on the chop saw to those dimensions. Okay, so I have this nice cedar from a farm in Blairstown. It's been milled, it's been dried. I just am a little bit too short on this one board I thought would be long enough. So I'm going to take this one, and it just happens to be wide enough. And I'm going to use the bandsaw, and I'm going to cut out a strip, 3/4. Actually, a little bit proud of 3/4. And then I'm going to mill it down over there with the planer. So I'll show you all that.
I'm just scratching the surface.
All right, so here's the piece I just cut on the bandsaw. You can see I had it set to a little bit over 1 inch, but you know, you can tell it's not the world's smoothest cut. So we're gonna come over to the thickness planer, which right now is set on finish. So I'm gonna set that to dimension once I started. It's super loud, so I'm gonna turn the sound off for you. But basically, I'm gonna take this down to 3/4, nice and slow.
I'm just scratching the surface.
So now as you can see, it's just a little bit wider than the wood, the rest of the wood I have. So I'm going to rip it down on the table saw. And an easy way to do that is a blade. And when we cut, we want the teeth to be a little bit higher than the wood. That way there's not so much tear out. It gives the teeth a downward spiral. So we can just set the piece that we already have and set our distance there, and you can see it's 2.5, a little bit over 2.5 right there on the gauge. So we're going to come down here and we're going to open up the blast gate on the table saw, remove this, and 1 second, I'm going to set this up. I'll show you how to use this. So basically what we have here is a push block called a gripper. And what's cool about this is you can set it so that you have 3 dimensions to move your wood around without getting close to the blade. So what I did was I made sure that I wasn't going to contact the blade with this as it moves through, and then I went and set the height right here. Actually, this needs to come down slightly. There we go. So that keeps that pushed all the way down to the table. So I should be able to do this one-handed because I have the gripper. I'll show you what to do. I'm going to turn the table saw on. Tricky with one hand. I had to put the phone down for a minute there, just so I could get the right position there. But you saw that piece of wood fly back. That's called kickback, and that's what you want to be really careful of when you are using a table saw. That was just a tiny little piece, so no big deal. But I had the main piece supported, and when you're using it, when you're using the gripper, I'll just give you another little how-to. You want to apply force down. You're also pushing this way against your fence. Okay. As you roll over, you keep giving that force, keep applying it, and there you go. You'll see here that it's very important that you use your riving knife. That's what this is here. And that keeps the wood from binding back together like this and pinching and causing a kickback, which can be dangerous. And that's one way to lose fingers. So we need to be very, very careful using a table saw. So I picked my 4 pieces of wood, and if you remember, our dimensions are 24.5 and 8 5/8. So I'm going to start by setting my stop block over here to 24.5. So what I'm going to do is look down the stop block straight down and set it exactly to 24.5. Tighten it, and then I can come over this way, taking the 2 longer pieces. And what I want to do first with this piece is I don't want this checked end. You can see there's a crack there. That tends to happen. This side looks okay, but just to get a real nice clean cut, what I'm going to do is cut both sides. So I'm going to start with this side, cutting it, and then I'll cut the other side.
I'm just scratching the surface.
Okay, so we needed 8 5/8. Let's see how we did. It's pretty spot on, huh? And 24.5. So let's come over here, set this one up. Perfect. So before I build the doors, I like to drill these holes first. That way, if I screw them up, the whole door is not ruined. So what I did was I drilled that first one about where I wanted it, and then I figured out the center, which was 5 1/4, and I marked that here, and I'm going to drill the next hole. And there you go. Those will sit in there flush, so that should work out. Now what we're going to do is cut the groove along the sides that our plywood right there is going to fit into. So there's a couple ways to cut a groove, and I usually like to use my dado stack, which is a bunch of different blades that go with these blades, and you can set different widths to cut through. The problem is the smallest I can cut is 1/4 inch. So if we were to come over here and just take a look at the thickness of the plywood that I want to use, it's kind of hard to see, but I will start, let's say I start at the 2 inch mark so you can see it. You can see that it is less than 1/4 inch by a whole 1/16. So we actually need to cut a 3/16 groove. So what I'm going to do is use the regular blade that I have on my table saw and then just sneak up on the width that we want. I'll show you what I mean. All right, so I actually found that most of my wood was 5/8, so I ended up milling it all so that it was exactly 5/8. Now what I'm doing here is to find the center that I want to cut my table saw. What I did was I figured 1/2 of 5/8, and that's going to be 5/16. So if we take our first piece and we look at how the blade hits the wood, you'll see it's right in the center where we want to be. So I'm going to start running those through, and I'll show you with the middle pieces, since you're not going to see the sides because they're going to be sandwiched in between our two longer pieces, I'm going to cut all the way through. With these, I'm only going to cut to about here, and I'll show you how I do that. Forgot to mention, we also want to set our blade height. So I'm going to set it to about, I think 1/2 inch is plenty for our reveal. So what I'm going to do is take my little square and level it out. Since I don't have a blade depth gauge, I set it to 1/2 inch, and then I just level it with the tip of the blade until the bubble is level. And that gives me a fairly accurate depth. There you can see the first cut through, but that's still not thick enough yet for the plywood. So I'm going to basically take the fence and move the fence ever so slightly so that this gets wider, and then I'll flip it around, do the same on the other side until we fit. As you can see, that's really quite a snug fit, so I'm just going to take a tiny little bit more off. I said, I don't want you to see the groove because you're going to see the top of this board. So what I'm going to do is actually start this coming down right here. And then I'm going to come along and I'm going to lift it when it gets to right about there. And what I'm going to do is actually mark the position here on my table saw so that I know where I want to stop it. Okay, so I just put this together roughly and I realized that I did not take something into account. Easy fix though. So our total width of our cabinet needed to be 9 5/8, but what did I forget? I forgot to add in the sides, which is 2 1/2 each, right? 2 1/2. So we're gonna take 2 1/2 away over here and 2 1/2 away over here. So that's 5 inches from our 8 5/8, which leaves us with, from our 9 5/8, which leaves us with what? 4 5/8. So I actually need to take these and cut them smaller, but that's no big deal. Easy fix, right? All right, so I went and cut those off camera, and now you can see our total width is the 9 5/8 that we wanted. Duh, sometimes you don't think about everything, right? So the reason I put these together, and I'm glad I did, is I want to know the dimensions for the plywood that I'm going to put in here for our door. So our opening right now is 4 5/8. Remember, I cut a 1/2 inch into either side. So that means I'm going to add a total of 1 inch to my 4 5/8. So my plywood should be set to 5 5/8 width. So our height was set to 24 1/2. And if we take away the 2 1/2 for the top and 2 1/2 for the bottom for our interior, that's going to leave us with the taking away 5 inches, which gives us 19 1/2. And then we're going to add the 1/2 inch for our slats on both sides. So that's a total of another inch, which gives us 20 1/2 inches. So our height's 20 1/2 inches and our width is 5 5/8. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to cut that on the table saw, and I'll show you how to do that too. Okay, here we are. So I ripped that piece to 5 5/8, and now I'm going to cross cut it with my Crosscut sled from Nick Ferry. He designed this. And what this does is it allows you to cut it on the table saw in a straight line. This is perfectly perpendicular to the blade, and you make sure that it's perpendicular by using the 5-cut method. And you can check out his YouTube video if you want to learn how to do that. It's pretty cool. So I could also do this on the chop saw, but I figured I'd show you how to use the Crosscut sled. So I just found out that these corners are kind of holding it out just slightly because of the way that I dropped it onto that round blade. So all I'm gonna do is just come along and use the disc sander here and round over these corners because you're not gonna see them anyway. Okay, so I just kind of threw it together. You can see how it might look rough together here. What I'm gonna do now is use my router, and I'm going to put just a slight chamfer or a bevel on all of these sides. I think that'll look nice, and it'll give it a little bit of that shadow you're seeing here, even when it's glued up tight. Okay, so I have my chamfer bit set up in the router, and I raised it up to a height that I think will give me just a tiny little bevel there. And what I'm using here is called featherboard. And what I did was I set that to the height of the block, and as I push this through, you see the feathers come up, and that helps push the block so that it maintains consistent contact with the router bit. So I'm going to take this little piece of scrap that's the same width, and I'm going to just give it a test bevel and see if I like the way it looks. Another trick that I learned is that when you're doing bevels, especially on a router, what you want to do is do the end grain first. That way, if you have any chip out from the router coming out and just pushing out some of that grain, you can kind of go over it later when you go along the sides. I'll kind of show you what I mean when I'm done.
I'm just scratching the surface.
Okay, there it is with the bevels put in. Now what I'm going to do is put some dowels in there to hold it in place and glue it up. So to put dowels in, I'm going to use this dowel jig. And what I do is I'm going to use the 1/4-inch dowels because they're small enough for this purpose. And I want the dowels to go halfway into the side of this wood. Remember, this wood was 5/8 thick. That's what I planed it to. So what I did was I set this to 5/16, which is half the thickness of that board. And I'm coming over here, and what I'm doing is I'm setting it so halfway into that dowel is going to be 5/16. So right in the center of that dowel hole, we'll have 5/16. And once I have that set exactly where I want it, I just tighten it up. And now when I drill my dowels, they'll be right in the center of the board. So my dowel length is about 1 1/8 inches. So what I did was I set the depth here to be 1/16 over 1/2 inch, because that would be half of the dowel, right? So 9/16. And then what I'm going to do is set the depth of this dowel bit so that this protrudes out of the jig at that 9/16 that I set before. So that way, when I screw them to the board, it'll be half the dowel width, a little bit more than half the dowel width for both. One other thing that I like to do is, now that I have this set where I want it to, I'm going to come along and just match up the edges that I want to keep together. So I put 2 marks and 2 marks, 1 mark over there. Down here I'm going to come and put 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That way I just know which edge goes where and which face faces up. So what I did was I measured in here 1.25 inches and I marked it. That way I can go right to the center. So I'm just going to take this jig and I'm going to line it up. And when I drill, nice and carefully, my dowel hole will be right in the center. I'm going to keep doing that.
I'm just scratching the surface.
So now all the dowels are drilled, and we just can pop them in. And you can see that all of our edges line up fairly well. So what we're going to do from here is do the glue up. I'm going to let that sit for a couple hours, and then we will sand it and give it some finish. All right, so here we are. I've got my clamps set up and the pieces, and we're just going to start by laying some glue inside of our grooves. Gonna make sure we get every part of that in there. The trick to gluing is making sure you have as much surface touching with glue as you can. Okay. We're going to fill up that dowel hole, and I'm going to hit up the sides here where our pieces are going to be touching. I'll stick this in here about where it needs to be. And I'm going to keep doing the same thing. And as I go, I can match up my marks on my pieces to make sure that all of my holes match up together.
I'm just scratching the surface. I'm just scratching the surface.
All right, so this is all glued up now. You saw it in the time lapse. I added some plywood out there just to clamp to so that I wouldn't mar up the sides too badly. And tomorrow we'll come in after this is all dried up and I'm going to give it a finish sanding, and we'll apply some finish and add the hardware and put it on. And I'll show you all that tomorrow. Tomorrow that'll be all glued up and I'll show you how we're going to finish that.
I'm just scratching the surface.